Joining us now, historian and biographer Craig Shirley. His new book is Last Act, about the final years and emerging legacy of Ronald Reagan. Great to have you on the show, Craig.
Thank you.
You have, well, there's some pretty shocking revelations about the relationship.
I hope so.
The relationship with Bill and Hillary Clinton. Let's start there.
Well, there's no doubt there was a lot of animus between the Clintons, and more so on the Clintons' part toward the Reagans. They didn't really have much of a relationship. In the week of the Reagan funeral, Bill Clinton made pretty much a pain in the neck of himself because he kept pestering anybody who was associated with Nancy Reagan to speak at the funeral. And the military district of Washington had already worked it out with the Reagans years before as to who was going to speak at the funeral. It would be the current president, whoever he was, Republican or Democrat. It would certainly be former President Bush, Brian Mulroney, and Margaret Thatcher because of their, fast friendship with Ronald Reagan. So, but Clinton, kept calling and pestering, and he had to be told no. And also, too, is that, as I said before, there was a lot of animus there, including the fact that in 1996, when Clinton was running for re-election, he used footage of the assassination attempt on Reagan in campaign commercials where he was making gun control as part of his platform, and that did not sit well with Mrs. Reagan at all. She called the Clinton White House twice asking the commercials be taken off, and Clinton never returned her phone call. So there was just no way Nancy Reagan was going to allow Bill Clinton to speak at her husband's funeral.
All right, Steve Schmidt.
Craig, you wrote a tremendous column a couple weeks back remembering Peter Hannahford, a friend of both of ours, the great Reagan speechwriter and aide who unexpectedly passed away. Wondering if you would reflect for a moment on Pete's life, his contribution to American conservatism in the context of this fight that we're seeing out today. What lessons would Pete Hannahford have for us at this moment of testing inside the Republican Party?
Well, he was a very dear friend of both of ours. We both knew him for many, many years. He was gentle, kind, utterly completely ethical. I can't imagine anybody more incapable of doing a dishonest or dishonorable thing than Peter Hannahford. He was, of course, as we all know, he was a longtime aide, confidant, and speechwriter to Ronald Reagan. In fact, I would suggest that he and Ken Khachigian were, for a long time, two of Reagan's favorite speechwriters. He wrote the speech in Detroit in 1980 where Reagan accepted the nomination, where he talked about a community of shared values and outlined a lot of really revolutionary thoughts. And in a way, there's some overlap between what you were talking about previously in terms of Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan, is that they're both anti-establishment, they both challenge the status quo, and they both talk about the future. In fact, I would submit the proper state of the Republican Party is to be in a perpetual state of revolution, going back to its founders, and certainly Abraham Lincoln was anti-establishment, Teddy Roosevelt was anti-establishment. The most successful presidents and the most successful presidential candidates have been perpetually anti-establishment and advocating a political revolution, not societal or anarchy, but political revolution.
Craig, one of the things you're great at is rethinking things that everybody thinks they already knew about and also finding new information. Just talk about the things you had access to bring to life this period of President Reagan's life that people haven't read about before.
Oh, thanks, Mark. I had exclusive access to files at the Reagan Library that weren't made available to anybody else. I talked to all of the president's, former chiefs of staff, Joanne Herring and Joanne Drake and Fred Ryan and all the key staffers, all the key advancement, all the key individuals. And the book covers really the last 2 years of the Reagan presidency and then the next 16 years. And I think what I wanted to do was to correct the historical record. The shorthand is that Reagan went back to California, announced he had Alzheimer's, then passed away. But as a matter of fact, he lived for 16 years, and there was a lot of living in those 16 years, a lot of political speeches, a lot of campaigning. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth. It was a halcyon time for him and Mrs. Reagan. They weren't going to slow down, and they didn't until really the last couple of years.
Craig Shirley, you and I email a lot back and forth and laugh at people that claim the mantle of Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party, that seem to have very little to do with what Ronald Reagan stood for throughout his entire public life. As the preeminent Reagan historian, you and Mr. Cannon, of course, talk about Donald Trump. Is Donald Trump winning the Republican nomination an abomination to the party of Reagan, as many would suggest, or is it a natural step forward?
I think it's a natural step forward, Joe. You know, and we've talked about this, is that the Republican Party, as I said earlier, I think it gets in trouble when it becomes part of the status quo. The modern Republican Party, and Reagan understood this acutely, was to be anti-status quo, anti-establishment, and that was the secret to his success.
Craig,
he was constantly reframing the debate. He was constantly reframing the debate, and that's what Donald Trump does. He constantly reframes the debate.
And Craig, we hear people talking about Ronald Reagan now in glowing terms, like, oh my God, how could Donald Trump? I'm sorry, I remember how Ronald Reagan was talked about from the mid-'70s up until the moment he was elected president. He was mocked, he was ridiculed, he was abused, he was called an idiot, he was called a bumpkin, he was called a
great big actor with premature orange hair. Yes.
Exactly. Things every bit as harsh as Donald Trump is being talked about, described now. I am not comparing Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump, but at the same time, people that are praising Ronald Reagan now and saying Donald Trump is no Ronald Reagan were some of the same people that were tearing Ronald Reagan to shreds before he became Ronald Reagan.
That's right, exactly. The first rule of the bureaucracy is to defend the bureaucracy, and that means anybody who is a threat or a challenge that must be attacked and must be ridiculed and must be destroyed. You're absolutely right. Ronald Reagan, from the time of his rise in the 60s right up until, in fact, in my book, Last Act, the week of the Reagan funeral, it was that there were many harsh commentators and columns and things said and written about him that came out of, just not of academia, but out of the liberal media. Some really, really awful things that came out of left-wing groups. You know, Ted Rall, who was a cartoonist, said something I can't even repeat. It was so awful. But you're absolutely right, and I think that again is that part of there's a transfer of a power is that the more they attack Donald Trump, the stronger he becomes.
Well, the book is Last Act: The Final Years, an Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan. Craig Shirley, thank you very much.